Hello and welcome to the video. This video is aimed at all of you line of sight fixed wing pilots that want to maybe have a go at FPV in a fixed wing. It's actually my favorite way to fly FPV. I have loads of wings in here. I've done things with iNav, RD Pilot and lots of other things as well, and it's fab. If you are in that situation and you are looking to go into FPV but the idea just feels a bit overwhelming and is a bit scary, then don't worry. What I'm going to do is very quickly go through the 4 or 5 lessons that I tend to use. And in fact, I've just finished with a buddy of mine who absolutely was worried about the whole FPV thing, and he's now done his first FPV maidens, and he is very relaxed and very happy about it. But I think the reason for that is because he has been through these 4 or 5 lessons. So if you're already an FPV pilot and know what you're doing, then this probably isn't the video for you, unless you are looking maybe to teach one of your buddies to fly FPV fixed wing. You probably have your own system. This just happens to be the way that I do it. But before I get into the details, a couple of quick slides. One on why it can be so tricky. When I came to FPV, was really worried about the whole idea. How's it going to work? How was I going to make sure it was safe? How am I going to replace all the things that I rely on as a line of sight pilot? Because by looking at the plane, I know how high it is, I know the direction it's going, I also know the attitude of the plane. Is wings drops? Is it climbing? Is it falling? With FPV, you lose all of that feedback, so you've got to relearn it so that just by looking through the image in the goggles, you can figure out exactly what's going on. And it can be a little tricky to find people to give you a hand with this. At the end of this series, the last video, I will do a quick slide on some tips and tricks if you haven't got a buddy to help. An awful lot of places these days seem to view FPV like the drone thing, and it's almost become a little bit of a dirty word, and that's a real shame, because flying fixed wing FPV is an amazing way to fly, and every single FPV fixed wing pilot I know that's come to it, ages 20 to 72, have walked away from the experience absolutely loving it. So don't be put off. It's not for everybody, but my experience has been that pretty much everybody who tries it realizes what they've been missing. Couple of quick safety tips. Most places in the world rely you to have some kind of spotter if you're going to fly FPV, so you need a buddy that has a visual lock on the plane if you're flying to be safe. Adding things like a GPS return to home feature or some stabilizer on the model can give you an extra level of support, gives you an oh dear switch in case something horrible goes wrong. You might never need it, but in the event that something nasty happens, you can flick that switch as well as kind of get your buddy to bail you out. Make sure you know how to use the goggles, what all the controls do, and one of the problems that I see quite a lot is that pilots will start the flight with it on their forehead, and then they'll get up to altitude and be circling, and they'll go to pull it down and accidentally catch one of the buttons that will change the mode and make the screen go black. So be aware of that. Be comfortable with one hand, because you have to take your hand off the controls briefly to pull your goggles down, that you can pull it into place reliably every time without turning the goggles off. And the last other comment is use a decent camera on the model. The cameras that I really like and I tend to put on stuff, you'll find in the builds that I do in the series, things like the Run Cam, Eagles, Eagle 2, Eagle 2 Pro are my preferred options. Things like the Run Cam Racer are very good. Foxeer do some great cameras as well. If you use a cheap one, it looks like this, and it makes it very hard to see where you're going. So the first part is finding out whether it's for you. Now, obviously you can watch the FPV videos on YouTube. Most of the FPV videos on YouTube, though, are people showing off how amazing they are flipping and rolling around. That's not actually a great way to do your first FPV stuff. And you can, with most video goggles, have some kind of HDMI input. Watching FPV things on the screen is a very different experience from watching them in the goggles. Imagine that you are the pilot and try and think about what you might be doing with the sticks, the throttle, aileron, elevator, rudder to perform those maneuvers. In fixed wing, you tend to find there's less of the looping and flying around and hang time and stuff that quad pilots do, but try and find quite relaxing videos to watch just to get an idea of it. Now, when I first started, I found that watching anything through the goggles made me quite dizzy. It kind of made me motion sick, but over about 12 to 15 flights, that receded and it became an awful lot easier. So if that happens to you, then stick with it. Just take the goggles off when you start to feel a bit hot and sweaty and you start to feel a bit unwell. Once you're happy that you can do that without feeling that you want to throw up, and not all pilots do that, but quite a high proportion in my experience do, then you're ready for step 2. Step 2 is only useful when you have an FPV buddy. Again, we'll get to the end and talk about if you don't. Now what this is about is just giving you an experience of a real life flight. I would always recommend picking a place and kind of sticking with that place through all the lessons, because you'll start to get used to what the landscape looks like from a couple of 100 feet in the air. So set it up as you would like a line of sight trainer flight. So your buddy, who is the FPV expert, has the master radio, you have the trainer radio. He can take the model up, line of sight, get some decent altitude and fly it around. And then you can put your goggles on and watch what's happening. Now, there are 2 or 3 things that you're really looking to get the hang of, and it can take 5 or 6 flights for you to feel comfortable that you have all this information unconsciously coming into your brain. Now, as I talked about at the beginning, you have lost all that line of sight information about height, orientation, direction, everything else. So you want to figure out where you are in the field and where home, or where you and your friend are stood in relation to where the plane is looking. You need to get a good idea of what the landscape looks like. You need to get better at gauging height, and having the horizon in the middle of the screen will probably mean you're flying straight and level. If it doesn't, then adjust the camera on the model. So if you are looking down at the ground, that probably means you're diving or losing altitude. If you are similarly looking up into the sky, then you're probably gaining altitude. But get used to that and have an idea of how all that works. If the trees are getting bigger, then again, you're probably sinking. The other thing to concentrate on is when the pilot is turning, is watch what happens to the horizon. A common thing that I tend to find in fixed wing pilots is that you will use the aileron and you'll start to turn, but then you'll actually find that the elevator needs to be pulled back just a little bit to bring the nose up, because the nose will drop slightly in the turn. And watch what the pilot is doing. Once you've had several flights and you are starting to get comfortable with what the area looks like from the sky, getting an idea for how it all moves, getting a better idea at gauging the height and the attitude, and also watching how all the turns do, then you're ready to have a go yourself. So same setup. So have the FPV pilot or your spotter kind of on the master radio. This time you will be on a radio as well as your goggles. The master pilot can take it up to a decent altitude, and then when you're ready, you pull the goggles down and you do the flight with the goggles on using FPV. Now again, this is exactly the same thing, but now you're actually flying the plane as well as trying to take hold of all that information. Initially, for some pilots, it's a bit overwhelming. If it is, that's a reason to do it with a buddy box situation. So you can just go up, had enough, push your goggles up, and your buddy can kind of take back control of the craft and bring it in nice and safe. And the other thing I recommend while you're doing this, in addition to all the stuff you were doing before, because now you're flying it, remember, that you're trying to figure out and gain height, altitude, watch your turn. So when you turn, you actually keep the elevator back just a smidgen to keep the nose up so you don't lose altitude. Don't just fly around in big circles looking at this at the landscape. It's very tempting to do that. I would recommend doing almost like a course in the air, doing it clockwise and anti-clockwise. Pick 3 or 4 points and kind of fly to those points in series. And that way it actually gives you something to do, and it kind of focuses the mind on actually flying. And after several flights doing that, you'll forget you're flying FPV and you'll start to just be focusing on making sure that you're kind of heading in the right direction and heading for the next point. And you'll start to unconsciously forget about the fact you're wearing goggles and just enjoy the flying. Once you're at that stage, it's time for you to become the primary pilot. Again, I'd probably still recommend a buddy system. Have the buddy there with his radio so you can give him control. But you take off line of sight, I would recommend get up to a half decent altitude, a couple of 100 feet, pull your goggles down and do it yourself. Now this is a little bit more exciting for lots of pilots because they're in control of it. Again though, if you start to get into trouble, you have the return to home switch so you can bring it home to yourself, or you can kind of give control to your buddy and he can kind of take control and bring it back. But I tend to find that this step is quite a big one. By this point, you know how to fly FPV, you're comfortable with it, you know how the goggles work, you've got a real good rhythm set up here. This is just getting ready to cut the cord so that your buddy can unplug his radio and it's all you. And that's the end of step 4, really, is to have it so that your buddy hasn't got his radio plugged in. He's unplugged it and it's just you with your radio flying around, and your friend is acting as a spotter and just telling you what's going on and there in case of a problem. So at that point, you're flying FPV. The last couple of things that I tend to find people struggle with is launching and landing. Now, launching, a lot of the flight controllers have an auto launch function, so that's really good. You can actually launch with your goggles on and just throw it into the air. Depending on the mood I'm in, I'll leave a launch like that, line of sight, or I'll launch with the goggles on and actually throw it into the air and actually watch the ascent with it. Talking about landing is actually easier than you think. This is probably the last hurdle that my friend is currently working on. With landing, it's just kind of gently crashing into the ground is the way I would describe it. And with landing, all you do is you figure out where the landing strip is going to be. You come into land towards it. You make sure that you are looking or flying directly to the end of the runway or just slightly in front of it. Just as you're getting down to about kind of 20-15 feet, then you level out and you let the craft sink, turn off the throttle and let it sink into the grass. The grass will catch it and you'll just skid to a full stop. Don't be scared about the whole landing thing. If you can find an area that has longer grass, it'll protect the model. If you're not using a big heavy wing, most models will shrug off a slightly harder landing than you meant. Last thing to talk about then is, what about all of you pilots out there who don't have access to a buddy who can do that? You can go through each of these lessons without a flying buddy. Again, be cautious of the particular legislation and laws in your country. Lots of places require some kind of spotter to remain legal. I'd always recommend for you guys, just like all of these, always use a well-trimmed model. Make sure you've got a GPS or stabilizer inside and that works reliably and it flies beautifully line of sight. Try and fly in the same place every time and then you get used to the view from the air and then it's harder to get lost. I personally would, when you're starting out, launch line of sight and fly around, have the goggles on your head, powered up and ready to go. And then when you feel comfortable, pull them down and try and last as long as you can before pushing them up off your face. Try and stay reasonably close into yourself. And that way, when you push the goggles back up, you'll have a rough idea where you are and it'll give you a chance of spotting it quite quickly to reacquire line of sight control of the model. Having the return to home function is worth its weight in gold if you're learning on your own, because if you do get into trouble or you started to have an issue or you start to feel sick, you just pull the return to home switch, lift the goggles off your face, and then the airplane will usually kind of circle above you over the return to home position, and it takes a lot of that trepidation about losing the model away from you. And the last thing I'd recommend is always record your flights. Do use the DVR in things like your Fat Sharks or whatever it is you're using, and keep them in a safe place and watch them back. That's kind of free FPV training for those days when you can't get out. You can watch them back and also see how well you're doing those turns, whether or not the nose is dropping, whether or not you're going a little bit too far or you're overcompensating in the turns. And by watching that, you can improve and it gives you things to focus on next time. So hopefully that's interesting for those of you fixed wing pilots who want to try FPV. My advice would be go for it. It is a fantastic way to fly and adds a whole new element to the fixed wing part of the hobby. If you can find somebody to help you, definitely go and buy them a coffee or buy them a beer and rope them into this, and potentially even get them to watch this video series with you, and you can kind of figure out your own little system of going through it. But from doing this for quite a few people now, this is the way that seems to work. And again, every pilot has their own particular speed of going through the steps. Some people take on these ideas faster than others. Just because someone isn't picking it up as fast as you did doesn't mean that they're not paying attention. Just everyone has their own speed. And that's my last piece of advice. If you are going to do this and help somebody else, be patient. Everybody does have their own speed, and some things that you might have found really quick and easy and did within a flight, it might take them 5 or 6 flights for them to feel comfortable. Pay it forward, be generous with your time, and the hobby will grow and everyone will have a much nicer time as a result. So thank you for watching along with this. If you do follow these lessons and it works, then do let me know. Always great to hear of new pilots coming into the hobby, or a new aspect of an old hobby that they've been doing for a long time and having fun. Thanks for watching the video and watching right to the very end. You can find me in all the usual places on social media, and if you like the video and like what I'm doing here, then hit the subscribe button and hit the bell notification icon too. If you really like what I'm doing, you can go the extra mile and become one of my Patreons for access to me directly for support, and also giveaways and regular updates too. If you're looking for particular content, then check out the playlist. I organise all of my videos into playlists, so if you're looking for a particular topic, you can find everything here. If it's called Introduction To, it's designed to start very simply and build on that simple introduction to teach you all about it. If it's called For Beginners, then that is really aimed at people who are brand new to that part of the hobby. You can also search on YouTube for anything that you're interested in using the search function at the top. So iNav Painless 360 will find all of my videos and even the playlist around iNav. So thanks again for watching and happy flying.